I got really excited when Peter asked me to join the Spring Days in Atlanta to give essentially 2 talks. Today I'm going to be presenting about Spring Boot, give a very beginner entry into how you can get started with Spring Boot, and then tomorrow I'll do a little bit more about developer automation for Spring Boot. So going back to Laura, the Spring didn't invent it here. The thing that I want to start with is a picture from the past. So for those that don't know me, my name is Christian Dupuis, as Andrew just said. I'm actually a very old Spring framework, Spring project committer. I know Rod, the creator of Spring, from back in the early 2000s, and that picture I think was taken at the first Spring One conference ever held in Antwerp, in Europe, in the year 2004, I think. And if you look well, you can see me, you can see a bunch of other familiar faces, like Jürgen is on that picture, you'd see Rod Johnson on the lower right, and so on and so forth. So this Spring Didn't Invent It talk made me put this picture in, because I remember very vividly those discussions that we had in the very early days of Spring, what stuff needs to go into the framework, how do we implement things, and so on and so forth. So that, thanks for that. That was really, really nice to see. Before I start with the actual topic of today, I want to mention 2 things. First of all, typing, and I want to do a lot of live coding. Typing at that angle is really hard. And then secondly, my I key got stuck. So I'm kind of limited in my ability to type fast. So I need to see and try to avoid the I key as much as possible, which is going to be fun and interesting. Sorry? True, yeah. So what is Spring Boot? First of all, who is using Spring Boot in this? So about, I wouldn't say probably a third. That's good. Are you, the rest of the room, are you guys using Spring at all? Or so Spring without Spring Boot? Or you're completely new to Spring? I have too many questions on that. So I just assume that 1/3 of the room is using Spring and the rest is completely, or at least very new to Spring. So what is Spring Boot? I think Laura mentioned that Spring Boot starts to become the umbrella of the Spring family of projects and tries to make it really easy to consume all of those projects. So you saw that picture, which is the Spring IO platform, I believe, if I'm still right in the terminology, where you have all the various projects that Spring consists of. At the core, you have Spring Framework, and then it starts out to grow from the bottom up. Things like Spring Security, Spring Flux, Spring Batch, all those things got added over the years. Spring Integration is one of the very early ones. Some were removed over the last couple of years, like Webflow. But still it stays true that Spring is a collection of frameworks, or projects, I should say, which Spring Boot tries to make really, really easy for you to adopt. So it's opinionated, and most importantly, it's a convention over configuration framework. So if you're new to Spring, and you Google for Spring just try to find some documentation on how to get started with Spring. If you end up in an article in early 2000s or whatever without XML namespaces, you're kind of totally lost, because there are probably potentially thousands of lines of XML configuration, which makes it really, really hard to understand how you should get started with Spring. Out of this idea and the the emergence of Java annotations, a couple of years ago, we started looking at how can we make this whole process simpler? There was the concept of how can you auto-detect that Spring projects are available, that dependencies are available, and how can you auto-configure those things and give users just conventions instead of have them configure everything explicitly. It's a bit like the kitchen sink. It just you have a project, you throw a bunch of things onto the class path, and I don't know how that's going to change with Java 9. But it's still true with Java 8, you add stuff to your class path and things just start to magically work. They just run. So for example, you add a dependency to a security thing, to your Spring Boot application, and suddenly all your HTTP endpoints are secured. Previously, that would have been a fallacy of 1,000 lines and more of XML configuration to get Spring Security into your Spring MVC application. And I think which is very interesting in today is it is production ready. It gives you a lot of features that help you ship this application to production right away. And when I say production ready, it contains things that the 12-factor stipulate to be really important, like health checks, metrics, and all those things that you would need to add if you were to kind of implement those things from scratch, you would have to add those things manually. I think I mentioned that already. So I mentioned starter dependencies. So there's a huge list, an ever-growing list of starter dependencies. And a starter is essentially a collection of dependencies plus a little bit of code that is called auto-configuration. So the second you put something onto the class path, the auto-configuration kicks in and applies the kind of like the best-of-breed conventions to your Spring Boot application. And I'm going to show you how that works. You can use Gradle or Maven, so that's up to you to choose. Both are supported. But I think very importantly, it is opinionated, but then again, you can override in the good old Spring tradition, very early on. If you know Spring, you can override the Bean Factory interface. You can pretty much override anything, any strategy inside Spring. That was always a core idea of the framework. Make it pluggable. So again, Spring Boot follows that tradition. You can override all the properties, like you can change the conventions, the configuration. And if you don't like what you can configure, you can even go in and override and provide your own implementations of certain extension points. I think we covered that. One of the really interesting things here, I'm sure a lot of us came out of, and maybe some of you are still deploying jar files, WAR files into Tomcat, Jetty, or even WebLogic and WebSphere. With Spring Boot, this got turned around a little bit to an extent that Spring Boot, when you add the web starter to it, it'll actually contain and bundle up your application server. So there is no need for you to kind of stand up a Tomcat, Jetty, or WebSphere. You can just take your Spring Boot jar file, your Uber jar, and that contains everything you need to run the application everywhere where there is a JVM. And lastly, the cloud-ready aspects. So when you deploy something into like a Java PaaS, like Cloud Foundry, for example, you should add things that help the underlying platform to determine whether or not it needs to scale out, whether or not it needs to kill an application and restart one, and so on and so forth. So things like metrics, health checks, circuit breakers, historics, Netflix historics come to mind, logging, and also other things like around management, like changing your configuration on the fly, service discovery, all those things that suddenly become important when you deploy something to production. They just exist with Spring Boot. And with that, I don't want to spend any more time on slides, and I don't want to go into code and start spinning up a Spring Boot application from scratch. So the way you do this, and a good friend of mine, Josh Long, who is probably the most energetic person on this planet, he calls this website the place to start every day. So he goes to start.spring.io every day and creates at least one Spring project. That's the place to start your day. It's the place where you can go and bootstrap your Spring Boot application, your Spring application. The way you do this, you essentially go in. First of all, you can select if you want to use Maven or Gradle. Then I noticed that you can use Kotlin now too, which I wasn't aware of. Groovy is there, and then this Spring Boot version. What I would recommend, just leave the defaults there, they just work fine. So see, this key is not, there we go. Just going to click generate project, and it's here now. So I got this one created yesterday, so I'm not going to cheat, so I'll take this one. Next thing I'll do, I'll just bring this into my Eclipse. Import. And I do this with the existing Maven project support. Downloads, selecting this guy. Yeah, now I can see something. So here we go. We got a Maven POM generated for us. When I look into this, it's just a stock standard Spring Boot a POM with a parent, with a relationship to the parent defined, and that parent gives you a lot of like versions that are supported by the Spring IO platform. So when you start adding dependencies, you don't have to fill in version numbers. Most of those will come from Spring Boot. You can start this now. So for this, you would go into your start class, and you can see how easy it is to get started with just running an application. You have this main method here, and that just starts up a Spring Boot application. Take a look at this annotation. That's your main entry point to your app. Oh, better? Sorry. Yeah. So I can run this now. Obviously, that's just going to start and stop right away because we haven't actually done anything. This is just a main method that gets started, and it stops right away because there's nothing really magically happening here. The next thing, since I think most of us are really interested in web applications and let's do something RESTful, I'd go into the POM and use one of the really nice starters that Spring Boot gives you. Just called Starter Web, and that essentially gives you an application server and enables the entire Spring MVC and REST support that comes with the framework. So when we start this up now, I don't want to start the POM file, sorry. What's going on? I had this previous server running. So it actually didn't start up because my address was already in use, so let me just do this again. Another really nice thing about Spring Boot, they give you sensible error messages. Instead of just showing you a stack trace, they actually show you what might the cause be for this particular error. So in this case, it told me that, oh, you know what, you already have an application running on that port. So see here how my Tomcat server came up, and I can now go and kind of start hitting endpoints. Right now, there's nothing there because I just created an empty Spring Boot application with Tomcat in it. Okay, so let's put some things in there, and let's maybe give us a little bit more space here. Why did that go away? Perspective. Reset. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is add a REST controller to my application. So I would do this new class. I think by convention I would put that into a web package, and I'd say it's my greeting controller. So a REST controller in Spring MVC needs to be annotated by REST controller. So I'm going to put the REST controller annotation on this. And now I can start putting in my endpoint public. Oh, God. It's really hard to avoid that letter. Public greeting. And return hello from Atlanta. I need to define a path to this, so it's request mapping, and I can now specify a path, what my URL path should be. So I'm just going to do, greeting, and I also probably want to hand over some parameters to this method. So who should I greet? So let's say, who should be the person I should send a greeting to? So we're missing a return type here. Now we can put this in. So one of the things, remind me again, Java 9 still doesn't have interpolated strings, right? Interpolated strings are still not coming in Java 9, right? No. Why would we have that? So instead we're doing something like this here. And we should probably say string. Okay, so now this is really all you need to do to get your REST controller up and running. So let me start this. you see this mapping down here, so it actually picked it up by something called component scanning. So this annotation is also a stereotype annotation in Spring Framework. So whenever you put this on, Spring Framework will scan your class path and will automatically put this, recognize this bean and turn it into something special, in this case a REST controller. So let's go to hello null from oh yeah. Yes. See, that's what's happening. Right. What's that? You think? Hello, Tess from Atlanta. You actually don't, because it's only one. So this was way harder than I thought it would be, but mainly because like typing is really hard. So this is all you really need to do to get a Spring Boot application fired up, add a simple REST endpoint to it. So now, what if we want to like move some of this logic out of your web controller into, let's call it a business component, right? It's not really a thing, but I'm just going to create another Spring Bean here. And again, I'm going to put a stereotype annotation on this, which is in this case called service. And we want to have a public string, okay, start, and the method is called where city. So where are we right now? So this is going to be in Atlanta. And now, in my controller, there are various ways in Spring to dependency inject this particular controller now. You can make it explicit with a configuration class. You can do something which is called like property injection. Don't forget about this right away, because that kind of breaks the whole encapsulation point. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding a private final greeting service. And now I'm going to use a constructor to get this injected. So using fields. Oops. And I'll do this plus the greeting service city. So this now hopefully will tell the Spring container underneath to inject an instance of greeting service, and I call this method whenever I invoke this the REST endpoint. Yep. So that works. One of the things that you may also notice, and which is, I think, very common, you don't really, so you really don't want to hard code this into your application Java file, and I think this is where externalized configuration comes in. What if you wanted to move this into a configuration file now? How would you accomplish that? Again, there are a slide full of ways of doing this in Spring. I'm going to show you the Spring Boot, maybe a little bit more complicated way, but it's very extensible and it helps you to inject structured configuration data too. So I'm going to create like a property, configuration property, and then map that to into a property file. So first of all, to do this, I'm going to create a new class. Greeting configuration properties. So one of the annotations to familiarize yourself with is configuration properties, and with that you can define what the root key of your properties should be in your property file, in your YAML file. So I'm going to call this greeting. Now I get 2 of those. Okay, greetings, and we wanted a private string city. I'm just going to quickly create getters and setters for this. Select all. So now I added another Spring Boot construct called configuration properties. I now need to enable this. So to turn this on, I can go to my Spring Boot application and I say enable configuration properties, and that takes an array. Greetings of class. So what would happen now is Spring Boot would pick this class up, look for a YAML application property file with greetings keys in it, and if it finds a file, it would bind the properties, the configuration settings, to the city field in that class. So let's add something to our property file, and you see Spring Initializer created an application property file in a standard location. So that's the convention here. Application properties in source main resources. There's also application YAML, which you can use. So so now I think we're all good. But we need to use this configuration property class now. So I'm going into my greeting service, and again following the same pattern of private final Okay, so now I have an instance of this again injected, and I can use it here, properties.city. Okay, let's see if this still works. Yes, it does. So let's change something for a change to see if it actually does work. Yep. Right. So that demo worked, luckily. So creating a Spring Boot project from scratch, adding a REST controller to it, adding a business component to it, and wiring those two together, and then adding what I think is a common task, adding configuration properties that help you externalize configuration to your application. That's kind of like what I demoed so far. I think at that point, I think we're almost ready to take our little Spring Boot application to production. And for that, I think one of the things that everyone who's using Spring Boot needs to know is something called Actuator. So let's take a look at what that brings us. I've been talking about metrics and health checks, and Actuator is the thing that actually enables those things on your Spring Boot project. So again, Actuator is a starter, so let me stop this here. And adding a new dependency. And this by itself is enough to give you all the really nice features that Spring Boot offers you, like health checks, metrics enabled. So when we bring this up now, not again the Maven POM file, I can now go to my service and say, show me some health information. Well, that service is up. It tells me it is up and running. Other interesting things are, If you want to know how your application is configured, config props is probably something interesting. And now you see another convention in Spring Boot. Some of those endpoints actually are exposed by default. You can see them, like a health endpoint. But you probably noticed it doesn't give you much detail. It just told you, oh yeah, you're up and running. But my configuration properties, I'm not allowed to read. So they are protected. So when we go back into our starter, and let's make this a little bit more explicit so that we can actually get to some of those endpoints. I can add a security starter. And that will now use a default user and password that it auto-generates. It's going to be different every time. Again, you can configure this. You can hook it up to your LDAP. You can hook it up to your other authentication schemes that you have in your enterprise. And now I should be able to go here, user, update my request, and I'm able to see all the various, what did I ask for, config properties here. So let's see if we can find the ones that we added. Greetings, right. So here we see our greeting configuration properties was picked up by Spring Boot, and it shows the actual value. There is support in Spring Cloud to actually dynamically change those things and then have your application reread those things so that you can refresh configuration without restarting application. Let's go back to the health endpoint real quick. Remember what we saw earlier? We only saw like status up. Now that we are authenticated, we actually see a little bit more information here, which could be sensitive. So for example, when you use one of the data source support in Spring JDBC or Spring Framework, you will see what the state of your database is. And that also shows you some sensitive information. So what's your database version? What database are you using? So you certainly don't want to expose that to potential attackers. So one of the things that I find interesting when dealing with Spring Boot is you usually have backend systems that you connect to that you kind of need to manage yourself, and you want to propagate state, health state, up to whoever is calling this service to make sure that they only call you when the service is actually up and you can operate normally, or your underlying path starts to take you out of service when your health and the services that you consume are actually not operational. So the last thing that I like to do before deploying this to a cloud platform would be to add a custom health check here. So again, going in here, new class, demo. Indicator. And Spring Boot supports or ships an abstract health indicator for you. So that's a very simple way for you to implement the logic that is needed to indicate to the framework, is your particular system up or down? The only thing you need to do is implement the do health check method. And what I want to do here is I want to be able to flip the health based on a flag in the file. So private boolean running, if running v.up and down. So now every time every time you hit the health endpoint, Spring Boot would find this and invoke the do health check method. And depending on the Boolean flag, you would get up or down. Your service would indicate it is running or it's not running. Now we want to be able to flip this. And the easiest way in this demo to do this is to just have an explicit endpoint where you can go in, almost like a little feature flag or something like this, where you can say, okay, this service is now disabled. Normally you would connect that to, let's say, a circuit breaker or exceptions that you see in your application, or the state of a database query, for example. But in this case, I'm just going to put another void flip boolean demo and so with this I should be able to request mapping. With this I now should be able to go to this endpoint and kind of and flip the switch. So let's go here first, update our request. So right now it thinks the service is down because the demo health check, as you can see here, failed. So why did it fail? Because the initial state is false, so it returned demo down. So when we go now to demo true and back to health, it's up again. So that kind of like shows you, it's very easy to implement custom health checks, and I encourage everyone to do that. When I left Pivotal about 3 years ago, and between back then and now, I actually used Spring Boot to build an awful lot of microservices. This is one really important feature which always comes at the point where, oh, tomorrow is your production rollout. Holy, we forgot to implement that health check. We need this now. So keep it in mind when you use Spring Boot to develop. This is really, really useful. So I don't know how I'm doing in time. The last thing I would like to do is just get this up and running on Cloud Foundry and see how easy or not easy that might be. I haven't actually done that in a long time, so let's go to demo service. No, that's the wrong one. Okay, so the first thing you do, right now, like previously, everything we've done is run the service from the IDE. So I'm going to stop it here. And I've talked about very early on in this talk, I talked about how you can like package this up and create an Uber jar. So let's do this, Maven clean install. And that's what I meant by Maven and Gradle are supported. Both of those build tools will enable you to create Uber jars. And an Uber jar is essentially everything you need to run the application in any environment that has the JVM. So when you look at this jar file now, it's 16.4 megabytes. That's absolutely not the application code that I created with all my typos. That is all the dependencies plus my application code. So this is now, when I do this, I can now run with Java -jar pointing to the jar file. So without anything, without messing around with class paths, you are able to start up this service and run it. Looks like it is up and running, and that won't, sorry, and that will only give us an unauthorized because the password changed, but it shows you it's not a 404. The application is actually running. So the thing that we have to do now to get it up and running on Cloud Foundry is obviously need an account. And the first thing you need to do is cf.login. And that will ask you a couple of questions. Since I'm really, really bad at typing passwords, I'm not going to do this here now. I did this. It stores a token on your system, so you can run every subsequent task against the CF command line client without logging in. So let's take a look at what we have deployed. So there is a demo service already. I'm not going to touch that one, but I do cf push at lenta, and then it's p for, I don't know why it is p. You essentially point it at a jar file or a directory on your local system, and it's uploading that to Cloud Foundry now. Notice how quick that was. It actually only uploaded 321 kilobytes, and that's because Cloud Foundry locally, the client unpacked the jar file, recognized an awful lot of dependencies that it already knew about, and did not upload that to Cloud Foundry. Then you see the build pack kicking in. It's like an awful lot of infrastructure output that you see there that Cloud Foundry needs to get your application up and running. there's a little bit of auto configuration happening there, so they're injecting something into your application. That's this, where is it? Spring auto configuration. So if you're using services that come with Cloud Foundry, that becomes really interesting. They're injecting environment properties into your container, into your application. All right, looks like this is happening now. And we got an endpoint here. Surprisingly, nobody used this before. Let's say health. And here's our unauthorized. So there is a way to get to the log files. Let's say log, Atlanta, recent logs. Let's try to find the password in here. Is a bit of a... Yeah, there we go. Oh yeah, you're right. And now I forgot the 98. Yep. All right. So now this was everything that it takes to get from 0 to running an application on Cloud Foundry in, I don't know, 30 minutes probably. Any questions? No questions. All right. So thanks for your time and your interest, and hope I see you tomorrow again, where we'll take that application and kind of do the whole process with like a little bit of automation around it in like 5 minutes, plus a lot more. Thank you.